Hello, and welcome back to the Roker Rapport Podcast Extra. I think we haven't spoken since before the Nottingham Forest game. Christmas kind of got in the way. I meet you a couple of weeks after one win, two defeats, a depressing FA Cup exit. This week, we'll obviously be speaking to a Cardiff fan. We've got BBC Wales football commentator Mark Poyser. How are you doing, mate? You all right?
I'm very well. How are you, Graham?
Football sense, not very well.
You've had it rough the last couple of years up there. Let's put it like that.
Could say that again. Over the years, there's been some, like recently for us, there's been some quite memorable games against Cardiff, and you come up against us. We're bottom of the league. It'll probably be quite a young-looking side on Saturday. Things have changed since that 2-2 draw in Cardiff a couple of Christmases ago. Do you have any memories of the games between us that stick out in the top of your head?
Well, I remember coming up to the Stadium of Light, I think it was Halloween, must have been about 10, 11 years ago, when last time Cardiff were in a really good position, actually. They were flying at the top of the league. Michael Chopper, I seem to remember, scoring in a 2-1 win. In fact, I'm looking here, he scored twice, actually, so that's good memory on my part.
He did.
I just remember it being so incredibly cold, and Sunderland, did they end up getting promoted that season? In the end, 2006, 2007? Yeah, so at the time, Cardiff were flying, and I think Sunderland were down the other end of it at the time. How fortunes changed that season from that game in October. The Premier League game that you mentioned right at the beginning, that was at a time when Cardiff were going through a little bit of upheaval with their manager at the time, Malky Mackay, and the owner. They were playing in red as well for a start. They were 2-0 up, and then two very late goals from Sunderland cost them, and it all sort of unravelled really from then on. And then in the corresponding fixture that season in the Premier League, I think that 4-0 defeat was almost the final nail in the coffin for Cardiff. The defender got sent off quite controversially, I remember, at half-time, and it all unravelled then in the second half. Thankfully, from a Cardiff point of view, things have improved a lot from those days. They don't play in red for a start. They're back in blue, which is fantastic. And under Neil Warnock, he really has united the fan base again, which was fractured with the kit change, the colour change, and the owner and the managerial appointments since they were relegated from the Premier League. But since Neil Warnock was appointed in October 2016, it really has been City as one is their social media slogan, and it really is a bit of a mantra because everyone at the moment is singing off the same hymn sheet, even if things the last couple of weeks haven't quite gone Cardiff's way.
Talking about social media slogans, we're like the worst for it. I remember last year we had his strength, and then a week later, I think we gave a load of staff redundancies and took the first team to New York. So,
yeah, you've had a few difficulties, haven't you, over the last couple of years? And down here in Wales, actually, the way that Swansea have been doing things, going from upheaval to upheaval. A lot of people, certainly Swansea fans, have said that they could be the next Sunderland if they're not careful. So you've almost been a bit of a warning to every other club in the Premier League what can happen if things don't go particularly well and you're not able to get yourselves organised. So certainly from your point of view, we think you've got a good manager in Chris Coleman. A lot of people in Wales still think of him very fondly. And I think for the game on Saturday, he will get a hero's welcome back at the Cardiff City Stadium. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
I was wondering about that with Coleman because it's, I suppose, obviously Cardiff and Swansea. And he's a Swansea boy, isn't he, Coleman? Swansea boy.
Well, when he took the Wales job, there was a lot of opposition to him for that very reason. The Cardiff fans didn't like that he was a Swansea boy through and through. So it's testament, really, to the job that he did with the national team, that by Euro 2016 and the end of his time with Wales, no one was bringing that up. Everyone was singing his praises, saying lots of brilliant things about him, and a whole country was absolutely gutted when he announced that he was leaving. The outpouring of sort of, not grief, because it sounds like it was a funeral or something like that, but there was a lot of... it was an emotional time for Welsh football fans because he has been the most successful manager in modern times, only the second manager to ever take them to a major tournament. So it was a big loss for them, but I think a lot of people could maybe understand why he decided his time with the national team were up. And Diolch Chris, which is Welsh, the thank you, was trending on social media at the time. So I think tomorrow, certainly before a ball has been kicked, the Cardiff fans would certainly like to let him know how grateful they are for his work with the national team. So as he said, with that sort of Swansea connection, that is a testament to how well he was able to do to sort of win them over. And everyone will be very pleased to see him back at the Cardiff City Stadium.
Yeah, I can never... I mean, if say Alan Shearer got the England job and did really well, I still can't see myself liking him. I must be honest.
I can understand that. Wales is a small country. They haven't had a lot of success. When you've never been to a major tournament in 50-odd years, the man who delivers it sort of becomes a bit of a legend. And what Welsh football fans do is when they take to you, they do, you're one of them, and they do look after their own. So they will definitely remember fondly his time.
And it's funny with Coleman, it's as much as the results maybe haven't gone the way that we would hope, I think everyone's been quite impressed by him. But that brings me on to your manager. Now, fast forward from obviously what we've seen in the past few years, 2008, Cardiff are sitting in third place. I think, admittedly, from an outside perspective, they look one of the better sides. No one seems to love Neil Warnock. Nobody really wants him as your manager. But what is it that he's brought to Wales and Cardiff in particular this season that just seems to unite people? What is it that he does?
He's no nonsense, and I think he's very much like the Cardiff fans. You say no fans like him. I can tell you the Cardiff fans absolutely adore him. He's great with us in the press. Very funny man, very engaging man. He was actually telling us a story not long after he got the Cardiff job. His wife phoned him, and obviously his wife hasn't been very well. She phoned him to say, I've been reading the Cardiff message boards, and Neil said in his thick Sheffield accent, I told you not to do that, love. I told you not to do that. He says, no, you don't understand. Darling, they like you. They actually like you. So I think he's well aware of that reputation that he mentioned, but certainly the Cardiff fans absolutely love him. He, as I said, no nonsense. He says what he thinks. He wears his heart on his sleeve, and I think they relate to that. And most importantly, you only have to look at the results. In 2017, there's only 2 teams that collected more championship points than Neil Warnock's Cardiff. If you're successful, you're going to be loved. Case in point, Chris Coleman with Wales. If he's successful with you guys, you're going to love Chris Coleman. Any manager who's successful becomes a bit of a hero, and that's exactly what has happened with Neil Warnock. Him being able to unite a club and a fan base, I'm not really sure how he's done it because there were so many problems off the field. The fans felt very disconnected with the team and certainly with the owners, and it's almost like now the supporters have completely forgotten what happened with the colour change and what Vincent Tan has done in the past. No one talks about it anymore because they're doing ever so well in the league. I actually asked one of the Cardiff players, I forget, it was Lee Peltier actually it was, who played under him before at Leeds, and I said to him, what is it that Neil does? And he says, I've always been asked this question, and I can't come up with an answer. I can't put my finger on just what he does. It's just his very presence. It just seems to bring the best out of you, and I think when he said that, he wasn't just referring to players. I think he was referring to supporters as well, and it certainly rung true during his, just over a year in charge of Cardiff.
I think there's a kind of a different level because I think Allardyce has done it at a Premiership level. But when you look at managers that are not necessarily sought after by clubs of fans of other clubs, but there's a character and a kind of almost like a siege mentality. I think Warnock's very similar, like a Championship version of Sam Allardyce almost. He seems to unite people, and the fans can really get behind him, and the character that he builds kind of infiltrates the club in a really positive sense, I've noticed.
You mentioned a key word there in the Championship. I'm struggling to think off the top of my head of a better manager at this level in terms of doing it, proving it time after time in this level. 7 promotions, 2 from this league. He knows this division inside out. So last season's brief was to get them away from trouble, and he almost did that immediately. I remember them winning a couple of games to start with, and people were talking about promotion, even though they're only just out of the bottom 3. Such were the expectations when he came in. They finally had someone who knew all about this level, and he certainly has delivered in that regard. He said himself he hasn't really enjoyed his time in the Premier League. I think he prefers Championship management because there's so many matches. It's a real slog, as anyone who spent any amount of time watching their team in this division will know all about. I think he thrives on the Championship. Having said that, he doesn't really enjoy the Premier League. I think he would like one last crack at it, if you like, before he retires. Hopefully, from our point of view, that will be with Cardiff. But he made no secret of the fact he wants promotion. The very day he walked in the football club, I was at his first press conference, asked him his first question, I think something along the lines of, what attracted you to Cardiff? And he mentioned promotion. He wants to get a record 8th promotion. No one's ever done more than 7. There's him with 7. There's Graham Taylor with 7. Dave Bassett with 7. No one's done 8. He wants to do something that no one's ever done before, and he clearly saw Cardiff as a good opportunity to do that. And he's been true to his word so far if he can pick things up in the second half of the season.
I read quite a funny quote about him the other week, and I'll hold my hands up. Like I don't. I'm starting to learn the Championship more and more in terms of players. I've lost that kind of Premiership ignorance towards it recently. I remember when Virgil van Dijk went for 75 million the other week, and he said Sol Bamba is a better defender than Virgil van Dijk. Do you agree with him?
I was actually at that press conference when he was asked, because he said it a few weeks before. He said he wouldn't swap Sol Bamba for any defender in the Championship or Premier League. Virgil van Dijk had obviously gone for the 75 million, so he was asked, does that now include Virgil van Dijk? And he did say he's a better defender. He didn't say he was a better player. He said that Virgil van Dijk's got a lot more about him on the ball. But if you're just after defenders, people who will stop the opponent getting past you and getting the ball into your net, there's not many better about, certainly in the Championship. He used another fantastic turn of phrase as well, which didn't quite grab the headlines as much as the Van Dijk stuff did. But he said an attacker thinks he's got away, and then all of a sudden his big long octopus legs come round and flick it away. And we've seen it so many times. He has been a man mountain. When Warnock came in, he didn't have a club. He signed him for nothing in the October. He was his first signing. He's been an absolute revelation since then. Whether he's better than Virgil van Dijk, I'm not quite so sure. I don't think Virgil van Dijk is worth 75 million, but certainly if someone wanted to buy Sol Bamba in this January transfer window, given that they signed him for absolutely nothing, it will probably cost them £5-10 million because he's been an absolute colossus. And with all the injury problems they've had, he has been the one constant, if you like, and he has been terrific. And the fans as well, talk about the fans loving Warnock, the fans absolutely worship the ground that Sol Bamba walks on. Before Christmas, they came up with a song for him last Christmas, but instead of I gave it to someone special, I'll give it to Sol Bamba. So they've let them know exactly what they think about him.
It's funny you were talking about the mistakes Sunderland have made, and Virgil van Dijk was actually a player we were linked to an awful lot, and apparently we were quoted 13 million before he went to Southampton, and we kind of balked at the price. And I think if there's ever a reason to understand why Sunderland are in the mess they are, that was about the same summer that we signed Sebastian Coates on loan and Jack Rodwell for 10 million, and balked at the price of 13 million for Virgil van Dijk. How things could have been different, but there you go.
And, well, Neil Warnock said he had the chance to sign him for 6 million, so that was probably a year or two before the incidents you're talking about. And he said the Palace chief scout thought he was too slow and wasn't good enough on the ball. So he said, I hope that chief scout is watching this morning. And he said he had a little smile when he saw the news. He didn't mention who it was, but I think he knows who he is.
You speak with a lot of positivity, which is good. And I found I had this the other week exactly the same with Sheffield United, who went on to stuff us, as it was. But there's been a wobble. We talked about it a little bit before we started the podcast. I'm looking at the last sort of 5 games. You won mid-December, but since then it's been 4 league defeats on the trot, and then you've drew against Mansfield in the Cup. Now, not that we can see anything, but even our form based on the last 5 games is slightly better than that. But there's reasons for that, isn't there? There's reasons behind that.
They have had a crippling injury list. It might sound like excuses because, as we know, every team gets injuries in every season. But the number of players that they've had out, I've just jotted down a quick list before I came on to speak to you. And there's 2, 3, 4, there's something like 12, 14, maybe 16 players who they've had out injured at any point during this season, but particularly in December. They've had so many go down. They've had Kenneth Sahor, who was on fire second half of last season, got something like 11 goals in like 12 games in the second half of the season. He's been out from October to Boxing Day. It was one of those injuries where they just couldn't get to the bottom of it. And as it transpired, he was playing with a lot of pain before he actually was out. So before that, he probably wasn't at top form. He's still coming back to match sharpness. They signed a goalkeeper in the summer. He hasn't played whatsoever. They're probably their quickest winger, Kadeem Harris, hasn't played this season, did his ankle in pre-season. And particularly they've been hurt in the striking department. I mentioned Kenneth Sahor. They've had their backup striker, Danny Ward. He's had an operation. He hopefully will be back before the end of the season, but that's going to be months rather than weeks. Omar Bogle, a third-choice striker who's come in and done really well. He's had a bit of a problem. Matt Connolly, the defender, he played his first game at Queen's Park Rangers on New Year's Day, picks up a problem, out for a month. Lee Peltier, the fullback, he's out for 4 weeks, I think. And then the 2 big losses Aaron Gunnarsson hasn't played since October, the Iceland captain, international midfielder, really in the spine of the team. And then Sean Morrison, who got injured at the start of December, missed about a month. And we talked about Sol Bamba being a terrific defender. Sean Morrison's probably not a good defender as him. However, I think as a captain and a leader, he really does influence the rest of the team. And on the way back home from Queen's Park Rangers on New Year's Day, and one of my colleagues was driving, I was in the back, and I was just looking up a few numbers. With Morrison in the team this season, they've played 20 games, won 13, drawn 4, lost 3. They've kept 9 clean sheets and conceded just 15. Without him in the league, 5 games, they've won only 1 of them. They've lost 4. They've only kept 1 clean sheet, and they conceded 10. So you can draw your own conclusions from that, but his absence, any Cardiff fan who maybe thought he wasn't quite as influential as perhaps maybe Neil Warnock was saying early on in the season, well, those stats certainly back it up. That's why Neil Warnock turned down a big money bid from Sheffield Wednesday in the summer. He's such a threat as well at the other end. So the bad news for Sunderland is he played against Mansfield in the FA Cup. They kept a clean sheet, so he should be playing on Saturday. And he's probably been, along with Gunnarsson, he has probably been their biggest miss. And all these injuries, yes, but it's been that in December, they've had pretty much the same 18 players who've had to play all these games, and certainly Christmas, there's so many. Start of December, they were still in there, and then they had these 4 defeats, started with Bolton, I think, just before Christmas. So before that started, I think they were only 1 point behind Wolves. They're now, I think, 14 behind them. So it shows how quickly things can change at the top of the table.
When you're going through the list of players there, the one that struck me from the other game, obviously when you played at the stadium and beat us up at the Stadium of Light, was Zohore. I'm sure it was Zohore. I just remember we have real problems defending corners, and we've got real problems whenever someone with speed and pace and power comes up against, say, John O'Shea, for example. And I was really hoping that he's still injured, because he absolutely, for want of a better phrase, tore John O'Shea a new one up at the Stadium of Light. He was just torn to bits.
Well, he is back. He still looks a little bit off the pace in terms of sharpness, but that's gonna come. He scored a fantastic goal against Fulham on his comeback on Boxing Day. It was 11 goals in 17 games, actually, in the second half of last season. Certainly at the start of the year, that game in September that you're talking about, he was unplayable. Even though he wasn't scoring as many goals as he was last season, he was dragging defenders away because people were so aware of what he could do, and it was the other players that were coming in to score. He's allowed more space for someone like Junior Hoylett, for example, who's been an absolute revelation. Another player Neil Warnock picked up for absolutely nothing, and now looks like a £10 million player all of a sudden. So there's Kenneth Zohore to watch out for. And there's Sean Morrison at set pieces. I've seen him score a couple of goals, certainly last season. Really attacks the ball well, and he's got a long throw as well. There's a lot he can do for that team. So slowly but surely they're getting the players back. And now, of course, we're in January. They are keen to make some signings to try and help this group. So yes, they've had a bit of a wobble, but they're still right in it. I'm sure lots of Cardiff fans would have taken this position at the start of the season. It's just, obviously, they've had it a lot better than they've had already, so maybe expectations have been raised. I think Warnock himself said he's now got a little bit greedy. He thought they'd be maybe just outside the playoffs. Now they're where they are. He thinks they've got a good chance of automatic promotion if they can rediscover their form, which if they can get the signings right, and they've got a bit of money, the owners are backing him, then you would certainly trust Neil Warnock to find the right players.
Which actually reminds me, Vincent Tan. He's still there, Vincent Tan, I believe, right? He's
still there. I think his interest in the club has been pricked up a little bit by the arrival of Warnock because they're doing so well. I think he feels there might be a chance of the Premier League, so he's making money available. But as far as I've been told, the two of them, Warnock and the owner, Vincent Tan, they get on incredibly well because Warnock, look at what they've done this season, where they are, the results they've got, which anyone listening to this can see the results they've had this season. They've spent barely a fraction of the teams who at the start of the season you would say would have been above them, like Middlesbrough, for example. They've spent a fortune. Villa has spent a fortune. Wolves, money is no object, and up until a couple of weeks ago, Cardiff were competing with them. Their net spend this summer was something like just less than £2 million. So if you're an owner, you've got a manager who spends peanuts and achieves great results, so why wouldn't you get on with him? So yeah, he is still there. He might still not be the most popular man at Cardiff City because of what's happened, and we've already talked about that. But because they're doing well on the pitch, no one's really talking about Vincent Tan like they were when Russell Slade was manager and when Paul Trollope was manager. Once you get a couple of results, and you might hopefully find this in the second half of the season at Sunderland with Chris Coleman, once results start on the pitch, everything else just disappears.
Chris Coleman actually said something really, really similar to it before the Fulham game, which obviously was going into a year of us not winning the game at home. And he said, how do you want the fans to react? How would you like the fans to react to it? And he says, at the end of the day, I don't need to say anything to the fans. If the results are right on the pitch, the fans are fine. Funny you mentioned net spend. I didn't realise that with Cardiff, because our net spend was about 1.25 million. And everyone's saying, you cannot compete with that kind of money in this league. What did we expect? But you mentioned what Cardiff have spent, because that's marginally more than us. And I mean, it's under $1 million more. And if you look where Cardiff are compared to us, so maybe it is just down to management, and it is down to the feeling of a club. I think the problem we've got at the moment is you've got probably a manager who's got similar mindsets as Neil Warnock, with obviously a different personality, but you haven't got the core group of players really backing Coleman at the moment. The people like Kone and Dong. I don't want to mention anyone. I don't know if that's true, but from the outset, it certainly doesn't seem that some people are invested in what Coleman wants to bring, whereas Warnock seems to have had that period of time last season to build that. You could see that at the stadium, and you see that with a lot of teams like Sheffield United, or they're another example. I think the big difference with us is you do see there's a big fracture in the team, and where that is, I don't know. But Cardiff and certain teams seem to have that.
But what I'd say about that is Cardiff have been where Sunderland were when they first came down from the Premier League. They spent a lot of money in that first season. Their most expensive player was Bruno Manga, who's probably the only one left in that squad. They paid £5 million for him. They had people like Kenwyn Jones, who you know all about, of course, up there. He was earning a lot of money, wasn't really scoring a lot of goals. They had a lot of big earners, and they were in a bit of a mess, really, in terms of the salaries that people were being paid and the results that they were getting on the pitch and what people were contributing for the money they were getting. Sheffield United, that team you mentioned, they came down and went down again, and it took them, 5 years in League One to finally get themselves right. All it needs, really, I think, is the right manager. Sheffield United have got Chris Wilder, who knows the club inside out because he's a boyhood fan, and he can find the gems. Neil Warnock was the right manager for Cardiff. Their most expensive signing in the summer this year for Cardiff was Lee Tomlin, and at the moment there's a lot of speculation that he might be going out on loan. He's the only one they really paid any money for. They signed Nathaniel Mendez-Lang for nothing from Rochdale, and he started the season on absolute fire, bag of tricks. He's lightning fast. Hasn't quite been able to rediscover that form, but he was free. Junior Hoylett was free. Sol Bamba was free. Callum Patterson, who'd just come back after injury, he was free. So Loic Damour, who plays in midfield, he signed from the French second tier. No one had ever heard of him when he signed. He was free.
Callum Patterson, is that the boy from Hearts? I live in Scotland. Is that the boy from Hearts?
It is indeed, yeah.
Okay, good player. This actually gives me a little bit of positivity because, to be honest with you, we've got nothing. We've pretty much said we don't have any money, and it's going to be loan signings and free transfers. And truth be told, I've got a lot of faith in Coleman to bring the right characters into the club. He's already putting his mark on stuff. So it just goes to show, if you look at where Cardiff are, if we can keep our heads above water this season, give Coleman the summer, if we're all right, there's obviously scope for having a small budget and still doing a job.
Well, if you get the right players, and Cardiff have got a lot of the players actually from the division below, but it's worked because they're hungry. They're hungry. They want to get to the promised land because they've never been there before. And it was very telling. I remember an interview with him last season. We were talking about the summer and what he would do. And their parachute payments ended in the summer. I think the phrase he used was the gravy train was over. He was looking for people on more modest salaries in comparison. And it's actually worked out well for them. You think in your head as a supporter, once those payments end, well, that's it. What are we going to do now? We haven't got the advantage. But it can actually work in your favour because when you try and sign a player, they know you haven't got this big check of money coming from the Premier League. Chris Coleman hasn't had a transfer window yet with Sunderland. I'd think about that. And unlike the Premier League, I think, Sunderland haven't been in the Championship a lot over the last couple of years, which is why they've barely played Cardiff. I think it's only 6 meetings in 11 years. In the Premier League, if you're down the bottom, you're likely to stay there for the rest of the season. In the Championship, anyone can beat anyone. And you go on a bad run, you can plummet down like a stone. Likewise, you get a couple of results together, you can pull away. Cardiff were down the bottom when Neil Warnock took over, and had they not sort of had a little bit of a blip, I think it was about April time last year, they might have just been knocking on the door for the playoffs. And I think we talked earlier at the start of the year you won the title when you played Cardiff about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
You were bottom or something after a couple of games. In this league, there's very little difference between a lot of the teams. Anyone can beat anyone. Every manager goes on about it. But it's true. The cliche is true. And you look at your position, I think you were a couple of points off safety. That can change very quickly with a couple of results. Likewise for Cardiff, they get a couple of results and Wolves maybe slip up. And that 14 points can soon go down to like 4 or something.
You mentioned anyone can beat anyone. And that's the one thing I sort of knew about this league coming into it. But at the same time, I'm still surprised by how random the results can almost be. I mean, we went to Ipswich, I think it was November, October, and got beat 5-2. And then we went to Wolves, which for me was the only banker that would get beat. And we went there, went down to 10 men just after half time and drew 0-0. Like, you just don't know what you're going to get in this league. And it's kind of exciting. I just wish we'd win a little bit more, because then I'd be even more excited when Saturday comes, or Tuesday or Friday, whichever day it is.
Well, you only have to look at the Cardiff bad run that you talked about, 4 straight defeats. It's actually the first time Neil Warnock's lost 4 league games in a row as a manager for 9 years. But this run started with a defeat at Bolton, who were right up to their necks in trouble at the time. And since then, they've gone on a little bit of a run, haven't they, Bolton? But it started with a win at Cardiff, which even with all their injury problems, you wouldn't have predicted that result whatsoever. No. And look at Bristol City, struggling last season. They could have easily sacked Gary Johnson. They're absolutely flying now, were in the top 2 at one point, and played ever so well against Manchester City on Tuesday night. It can change very quickly once you get the right players in.
And I think a lot of, we were talking about another thing with this league as well. A lot of the time, it's not always about skill and quality, and it's about togetherness. It's about being hungry. It's about wanting it. It's about running that extra yard and winning that second ball. And that's a lot of where Sunderland, in my opinion, have failed this season. There's a lot of players that don't want to be here, or haven't got the gumption to be here, in my opinion. And I won't single out certain players, but I would like to think that's where Chris Coleman's going to change things. And he's been looking, I'm hoping he's going to bring in some of the people, the connections he has from Wales. That's the only worry we have, is that bringing people in, as good as Coleman is, and there'll be people that want to play for him. He doesn't have much money. He's having to make do with effectively loans and free transfers, but he's been out of club football for a long time, and you've got to ask the question, does he lose connections with that? But at the same time, I think with Chris, there's no one better to be in charge at the moment. I just hope for his sake, because of the gamble he's took on us, which is a huge gamble, to come here. I hope it works.
Well, what I'd say about him being out of club management, while he's been an international manager, I think he has improved massively as a manager. I mentioned a while ago that the Cardiff fans weren't having him at the start because of his Swansea connections. He lost his first 4 games in charge of Wales. He was really under pressure, and it didn't matter whether you were Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, Wrexham, or any of the Welsh Premier League teams, whoever you supported. A lot of people at the start weren't convinced that he was the right man. You've got to remember as well that he took over Wales in incredibly difficult circumstances after Gary Speed. But he changed things and did it his way. He said after, I think it was the Serbia game, they lost 6-1, and everyone thought, this is it, he's got to go. He said, right, if I'm going to go down, I'm going to do it my way. And even then, they got a lucky win in the last minute against Andorra in the first game of Euro 2016 qualifying. A lot of people were suggesting, had they not scored in the last minute with Gareth Bale, he would have gone then. And then he just turned it around. So while he's been an international manager, I think he has improved as a manager. I think he's a better boss now than he was when he was at Fulham. I think he's certainly more sought after. And when he's been international manager, think of the clubs that he's had to deal with where his players have been playing for, and he's had to talk about, for example, how they deal with Gareth Bale and all the injury problems he's had. He's dealt with Real Madrid, he's dealt with Arsenal, he's dealt with all these big clubs. He's going to have contacts at all of them. I think the manager that Chris Coleman is now, looking at it, taking a step back from all the emotion of him leaving Wales, I think if you're him, you see it as a bit of a no-brainer, really. Sunderland are a massive football club, big crowds, even when they're doing poorly in comparison to the crowds that Wales were getting when he took over. If he can get it right, the only way is up, and he's not that money is the be-all and end-all, but Sunderland will be paying him more than the FAW were going to be able to. He's admitted himself that the Wales job was not the best paying job, and perhaps he'd achieved all he could with Wales. He didn't maybe want to take that legacy. He's always longed for another club job. Any manager, I think, who's been in club management, then misses it when they step out of that. If he can get it right at Sunderland, that could be a massive, massive job for him. He keeps you up. He maybe gets you promoted, maybe the following season. His stock's going to rise even more. There's the blocks in place there because you've got that fan base that most clubs would absolutely kill for.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fractured one. It's a depressed one, but
if you get that right and you unite everyone, like Neil Warnock has done at Cardiff, then you're onto something very special.
Coleman's first press conference was brilliant. It really, it's different now because we've lost a few games, and for want of a better word, we've been shite the past few games, really, really poor. But at the same time, when you watch his conferences, there's still things he says, and you just think, you know what? He said something last week, and I thought it was brilliant. He said, "We're in a dogfight, and you don't go into a dogfight with kittens." And as much as you want to hear your manager talking about positive things, he was right. He was calling out those players that pretty much don't want to be here, and he knows that they want to be here. And I'm not going to mention names. We all know who they are. And I think that line, it instills belief in him. And I would love to play for him. And I've only known him for the best part of 2 months. But what is it that, because obviously you're a Wales fan, and I've never met a Welshman who's not a passionate Welshman. I've never met a kind of half-arsed Welshman. You're all passionate about where you're from. So what do you think, from an outside perspective, how do you see the Coleman-Sunderland relationship going? And do you think he can turn Sunderland around?
Well, without knowing in terms of what goes on behind the scenes with the owners and what have you, certainly when he was with Wales, he took over, as I said, in very difficult circumstances. No manager is ever going to take a job in more difficult circumstances than he did, with his best mate in football dying, the players having to come to terms with that, and him trying to take over and do things his own way. And Wales were doing well at the time. It took probably the best part of a year, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, for them and collectively as a group to come to terms with that. So probably the situation at Sunderland compared to the emotional circumstances with Wales is probably a lot easier in that regard. However, obviously your plight at the bottom of the table is well documented. What Coleman did with the Wales players is they all wanted to play for him. You think Gareth Bale playing for Real Madrid, and the Real Madrid would be saying, no, you're not going with Wales. You're not going with Wales. We want you to stay for us. We paid a lot of money for you. We want you to stay with us. Well, that never happened. He turned up for every game, every friendly. He was insistent that he wanted to play for Wales. It made a lot of people eat their words in that regard, that he turned up, myself included. I thought if they were out of qualifying, we wouldn't be seeing Gareth Bale. He was always there because they wanted to play for him. And after what proved to be his last game in charge with Panama, the senior players had a meeting with him at the hotel to try and convince him to stay on. They were desperate for him to stay because he made them all believe, and they all would run through a brick wall for him. All the younger players that were coming in all thought so much of him. So if he can get that with Sunderland, then you could be on to great success. But the key thing is, which ask any football fan, they're maybe not aware of it, but it's going to take him time. It's not just going to happen overnight, because Sunderland have been underperforming from my position, from the outside looking in. They've appeared to have been in a bit of a mess for a while. Things just don't go the other way in one transfer window. It's going to take a while. I think if he can keep them up this year and maybe build, it might take him 2 years, maybe 3 years. He might do it immediately, but you give him time, I think he will leave Sunderland better off than when he took them up. It's obviously a big job. There's obviously players that you talk about there who maybe aren't running through a brick wall for him. Well, I think you'll find anyone he doesn't think is capable of doing what he wants, they'll be gone sooner rather than later. And he'll be getting people in, maybe not with the biggest names, the Premier League names or the big price tags that you've been used to. But that, as we've seen with Cardiff and we've talked about, that doesn't mean they're not good enough for this level. As long as you have the spirit, that's better than any sort of big money player who maybe isn't pulling their weight. You get the spirit And that is the main sort of core thing, if you like, for success, and everything else follows from that. It might take him a bit of time to get that, but if you guys give him a chance, I think he will certainly get the spirit alone, and then we'll see whether the results follow.
I certainly feel like he's got our backing. It's funny, even though there's been not much has changed, we're still bottom. He's won a few games, yeah. He's won 3 more than Grayson did. But there's there's an air about Chris Coleman that just gives you kind of a confidence in him. And I wouldn't want to be a player that doesn't want to run through a brick wall for him, because it's not the easiest place to play Sunderland. It's the best place in the world to play. I know that. I've followed Sunderland for nearly 30 years. I know it's not the easiest place to play. I know we can be harsh. But if we're behind the manager and we can see you're not pulling your weight, and if he's having a go at you, we're having a go at you, quickly they're going to be leaving. And I just hope it happens fast enough where these players go and he brings in, a team. I don't mind if it's, you talk about big money signings, Jack Rodwell, 10 million. God, the things I would do to take that back. And it's not even my 10 million. I dread to think how well the show it feels. But if he can bring in the right mentality and the right team, I certainly think that from his press conferences and the things that he's said, he definitely has our back in 100%. And it's nice to hear you saying things about Wales, and also, pinpointing the fact that he didn't start that well. There was a difficult situation in a different circumstance, true. But at the same time, it's nice to hear that man's been through something that's tough. He doesn't strike me as someone who's worried about the Sunderland job. Not the way Moyes was, not the way Grayson was. They looked worried. They looked like they thought they couldn't do it. He thinks he can do it, and that's a real positive.
Well, if he didn't think he could do it, he'd still be the Wales manager right now, and he wouldn't have left to go to Sunderland. Interesting, you talk about about the fans supporting him. If the fans are supporting him, then he will get that time, because the pressure at any football club comes from the supporters. And I can use Cardiff as an example, because the last sort of 3 managers they've had before Neil Warnock, one was Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, who proved to be an absolute disaster, spent a lot of money, which some of the players we talked about, Cameron Jones, who maybe weren't pulling their weight in the Championship. When things didn't go well, the fans quickly turned on him. They then appointed Russell Slade, who the Cardiff City fans thought, well, hang on, this guy's never managed at this level. He's only managed in lower league. And they gave him such a hard time, wrongly perhaps, in my opinion, because he got them to within a sniff of the playoffs in his first full season in charge, and his remit was basically to lower the wage budget, sell all your best players, and wasn't given much money to replace them. So to get in the mix for the playoffs, I thought he'd ever so well. But the fans were never really taken to him. They didn't like his style of play. They thought it was boring. The gates plummeted. There's so many empty seats for matches. And when things didn't go their way in games, fans were on the players' back. It all sounds very similar to what Sunderland are going through now. They then went for Paul Trollope, who was his assistant. That equally didn't really work out. A man with not a lot of experience as a number one, certainly not in the Championship. He wanted to play a more expansive style compared to Russell Slade, maybe more dour style. That didn't work. Neil Warnock came in, and in the Cardiff City fans' eyes, he was a big-name manager in terms of the Championship. So his first game in charge, they had been getting up to that point like 11, 12,000. I think in his first game in charge against Bristol City, admittedly it's a bit of a derby game down here, but they got like nearly 25, 26,000. So they voted with their feet instantly. So he had their support before they'd even kicked a ball. So that straight away gives you a chance as a manager if you've got the fans on your side, because they're going to be less inclined to get on the players' backs. Things sort of snowballed from there, and it all came about with the right managerial appointments. The Cardiff City fans backed Neil Warnock. By the sounds of it, the Sunderland fans are backing Chris Coleman. So if a similar thing can happen, then you might be in Cardiff's position next season. You just don't know. Football can change ever so quickly, which is why certainly Neil Warnock hasn't been taking anything for granted, despite their lofty position. He hasn't been talking about automatic promotion. He's still been targeting the playoffs. All the while, when they were second, he was always saying, I'm more looking at not where Wolves are, but how many points the 7th team has got. He wants to make sure he's in the playoffs at the end of the season. So he is well aware of how it can turn the other way. Hopefully for Sunderland, it can turn that way. But it's still so tight at that bottom. A couple of wins and you can be right out of trouble.
A couple of wins and it changes the whole perspective at the club and
Absolutely.
The whole mindset completely. Moving forward to the actual game on Saturday, one thing I wanted to ask is one thing that I find crazy is that they moved the game for Sky to a 12 o'clock kickoff for one of the longest journeys of the season. I mean, I think everyone's got the same opinion on that, but that's what's killing modern football, isn't it? I hate to use the phrase modern football, but like it's just terrible, isn't it? I mean, if that was the other way around, how would you feel about that? What's your thoughts?
Well, Cardiff, like Sunderland, every game is a long trip from where we are. So it doesn't really matter what the kickoff time is. We have long trips. Neil Warnock's mentioned a few times actually this season when they've played on the Tuesday and on the Saturday away from home. He doesn't see why you should have long trips away from home. I think, was it Sunderland? We went to Sunderland on the Saturday, having played, I think, Preston on the Tuesday. So 2 mammoth trips in a couple of days. He's not really sure about that. Funny you mentioned modern football. I'm watching a game now, Arsenal and Chelsea, and before the game all the floodlights went off and there was a bit of a light show. I don't really agree with that either, but there we are. Both, you talk about clubs not having any money. Well, Sky are going to give both clubs some money for them having the inconvenience of playing at 12:30. And when you're in the Championship, I think you take all the money you can get, really, because there's not a lot in comparison to the Premier League. I do agree that modern football is changing and perhaps not for the better in all circumstances, but it's changing whether we like it or not. So you've just got to get on board, really. And whilst it's an incredibly long trip, if Sunderland win 2-0 on Saturday, no one will be moaning about getting up early. You only complain when it's a long trip and you've seen rubbish for your effort.
You complain twice as hard when you get beat for that kind of trip, but you celebrate twice as hard when you win. One thing I like to ask, and regarding the game, kind of last question sort of thing, but I do want a prediction and how you think the game will go. But before that, I've started disliking asking this question because it panics me a little bit and depresses me again. Is there anyone in the Sunderland side that you would take at Cardiff?
Well, funny you mention it, although he's not in the Sunderland team at the moment, but they're trying to sign Lewis Grabham at the moment, Cardiff City. 12 goals, I think, for you guys this term. They're trying to sign him on a permanent basis. From Bournemouth, so you actually might be able to tell me a little something about him. They obviously need a goal scorer because they've got a lot of injuries up front. Maybe Kenneth Ahoy isn't quite firing as he was last season, still not quite as sharp. They're trying to go for recruitments. He's talked about a lot of money for a top-class midfielder, but it's very interesting, I think, that they're trying to sign someone who is a proven Championship striker. Scoring 12 goals in a struggling team is no mean feat whatsoever, which is more than I think any Cardiff striker currently has, and they're at the top of the league. So maybe you can tell me a little something about Lewis Grabham.
Grabham's a funny one because you could ask different Sunderland fans one question and they'll probably give you one of two answers. They either think he's lazy and uninterested and they're pleased that he's gone, or they have my opinion where I think that Grabham just used his energy in the right way. I think that the chances he put away, there were a lot of them were tap-ins, but he had to be in the right positions. He always ran the channels well. He never looked like he was having fun. I'll give him that. He never looked like he was happy. He always looked miserable, chewing his gum, and his beard's not very good. He hasn't got the best beard in the world. But in terms of like a centre forward, he knew where the net was, and I'm actually quite gutted that he went because I think up front, and many people are going to disagree with me on this, but I think in terms of most important players at the club before he's just gone back to Bournemouth, I think he was up in the top 2, top 3, because you cannot replace someone who scores the amount of goals that he did, especially in the team that we had. And I spoke an awful lot about Darren Bent in that period, and a lot of people said, but he doesn't do anything, he doesn't touch the ball often, and he doesn't. He really doesn't. He doesn't look like he does much. He jumps for balls sort of half-arsed. He doesn't look like he's interested half the time. But Darren Bent, when we lost Darren Bent a few years ago, that's when things all sort of fell to the ground. Literally everything just like kind of went burnt to a cinder like slowly after that. And that was because we didn't have someone that could just stick the ball in the back of the net. And if you lose that, it doesn't matter how well you defend, it doesn't matter how creative your midfield is, it doesn't matter how good your goalkeeper is. If you lose someone that just is in the right place and has the knack of sticking the ball in the onion bag, you're missing an awful lot. And I think replacing him is probably going to be the toughest thing that Coleman's going to come up against in this transfer window, and he's got a lot of things that he has to contend with, a lot of things.
Scoring goals, as you say, is the hardest thing to do. What Neil Warnock likes is players who do their job. So when we talked about Sol Bamba earlier, he said before that he's told Sol, you just stop whoever getting the ball into our net. That's your job. You get in the way. And he says he does that better than anyone. He keeps things simple. So if Lewis Graham's job is to put the ball in the back of the net and he's scored 12 times in a team that's bottom of the table, then he's not doing bad whatsoever. You talk about him not enjoying it. Who would enjoy it when you're bottom of the table? But the other team chasing him, from what we understand, is Wolves. So there's 2 teams in for him. One is top and one is third. So there must be something about him. And you talk about players maybe not pulling their weight. If he came to Cardiff, there would be no chance of him not pulling his weight under Neil Warnock. So he wouldn't even be interested in him if he thought that he was one of those individuals. He only likes grafters, does Neil Warnock, and he clearly sees something in him. The other striker that they're looking at is Gary Medine of Bolton, another player in a struggling side. So we've said before, you don't have to pay millions of pounds for players. We're talking about 2 strikers here who, a couple of weeks ago, were both in the bottom 3. There's obviously something about them, because why would Neil Warnock be interested in them when they're third and going for promotion?
And Medina's the one that we were linked to a few weeks ago as well. But I think it's funny, the thing with Graben, I think the reason he's so Marmite, especially now, is the rumours around why he left. There's a lot of people think that a lot of people believe he went to Coleman and said, I don't want to be here and I want to go. But from the rumour mill, or the grapevine, it's what I've heard, is that he went to Coleman, or Coleman went to him and said, we haven't got the money to buy you. Your stock is high. He's approaching 30. Do you want to stay with us to the end of the season? At which Chris Coleman, I think, is quite right to ask that question. If, this is all hypothetical, I don't know if this is fact. And Graben has basically replied back saying, my stock's high. I'm wanted by a couple of clubs. I don't want to really wait till the end of the season to see if they still want me.
And you can't really blame him. Any supporter who was in his position would probably do the same, wouldn't they?
And I fully agree with that. I am very much on the side of Lewis Graben's a massive loss. I fully understand why he's went. I can't quite understand people who didn't rate him. But some people think he's basically gone to Coleman and said he doesn't want to be here. I don't think any conversation is as simple as that.
Well, if he did say he doesn't want to be here, then Coleman's done the right thing, hasn't he?
Yes.
In the position that Sunderland are in, you've got to have people who want to graft and want to work and do all the things we've talked about that the Neil Warnock players do. And if he doesn't want to do that, then you're better off getting someone in. There might also, as well, without knowing the ins and outs, I'm just talking anecdotally here, but I don't know what kind of loan fee or what part of your wages you were paying him. It might be that perhaps Coleman thinks he might be able to get couple of players in on those wages. 2 players is better than 1 to help perhaps in your position. There's a lot of things that happen at football clubs that not even myself as journalists find out about until maybe after the event. So there might be more to this than meets the eye.
Most likely, in almost every case, there's something more than meets the eye, I think, with these situations. But that's how it goes, isn't it? We're all, as football fans, I think a lot of us are very reactive and we make our minds up very fast and we very rarely change it. Before, obviously, I let you go, one thing I think I really need to ask, and as always, and I haven't had anyone who's backed us to beat the opposition team, but how do you see the game going? What's your prediction?
Well, a lot will depend on when we speak to Neil Warnock on Friday and we find out the latest on the injuries. There's been a few presses this season when we've thought, it's starting to get a little bit better, and he'll then reveal, so-and-so's pulled up in training yesterday and we've now got no fit defenders. So we need to wait and see who's fit and who isn't before we can be confident either way. I've got to go for a Cardiff victory. It won't surprise you to think that I'm going to say that. But they've been done ever so well this season. I think this is just a blip that they've been on. They're at home. From what you're telling me about Sunderland, this sounds like it could be their perfect game, if you like, when you're in a bit of a bad run to sort of get on the horse. I think a lot will depend on who scores the first goal, because Cardiff haven't been prolific in front of goal this season. Certainly not while they've been on this bad run. They haven't really been able to find anyone who's been able to stick the ball in the back of the net. I think if Sunderland were to get the first goal, that would make things incredibly interesting. If Cardiff were to get it, you've watched football, as you say, for a very long time. When teams who are struggling concede the first goal, they tend to think, here we go again. And it might be that Cardiff get a bit of a comfortable win. If you're asking me to stick my neck on the block, I think it could be a 2-0 win for Cardiff. Sean Morrison's back, so I would back them to keep a clean sheet because he's so important to them. And Kenneth the Haw is slowly but surely getting back to his match sharpness. So I'm going to go for 2-0 Cardiff.
Well, I'm gonna agree with you. I feel bad doing that, but we've only scored 2 in 7. I don't see us getting anything from it, and I think Cardiff need a win to get back on track. So, as depressing as this is, to give you an idea of our mindset and our as fan base at the moment, I'm going to agree with you. I'm going to say 2-0 Cardiff.
But then you're playing a team who are third in the league. This isn't a game that's going to define your season. I'm looking at your fit. You've got Birmingham, haven't you? Or that was postponed for the FA Cup. But there's Hull. There's Birmingham, Bolton, all these games coming up. There are the key games. When you're playing against teams around you, you have to get points against that one. I think from a Sunderland point of view, from the outside looking in, anything you get on Saturday would be a bonus.
Massively agree with you. Same as it was with Wolves of the week. Anything, a draw, I would take a 0-0 draw, 1-1 draw. I'll take anything on Saturday. Any of us would.
And it's weird because sometimes when you're down the bottom, it can just be one result that sparks it. If it's a 1-1 draw and there's a last-minute equaliser for Sunderland, that feels like a victory, even though it isn't, and it might just trigger something. It works very peculiarly. And similarly for Cardiff, when you're on this bad run, it can take just one scoreline to put you back on the horse. We were at Queen's Park Rangers on New Year's Day, and one of the local Queen's Park Rangers reporters, who obviously remembers Neil Warnock's time there, was asking us about the Cardiff slump, as you've been asking me about it tonight. Said it's weird because they had won the year they won the title at Queen's Park Rangers. They had a similar slump over Christmas. I looked it up before I spoke to you. It was 2 wins in 8 for Neil Warnock's QPR, December and January 2010, 2011. And then they went and lost 1 in the next 14 with 9 wins. So at some point they had to come out of that slump. And then they went on this terrific run and won the league. But I think the same can work when you're down the bottom. One result and it can trigger it. I'm always the optimist anyway.
I'm always the pessimist, especially being a Sunderland fan, but there you go. But
it's understandable.
Yeah, with recent seasons, I try to be more optimistic, but as you say, one result does change my mindset and it changes the whole fan base. So, and I think hopefully I'm not being too pessimistic and we pick something up and surprise me.
Well, I think with Chris Coleman, I think Sunderland will stay up. I think he's too good a manager to let that happen. Where you finish, I don't know, but from the position you're in, if you're fourth bottom, I think everyone would take that, and I would back Coleman to keep Sunderland up all day.
And I think I've got to end on that because that's a positive ending, right?
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for coming on, Mark. I don't wish you luck on Saturday, but for the rest of the season after that, as always.
Been a pleasure, anytime.
Thank you very much. Well, you look after yourself. Like I say, good luck after Saturday. Well, after, hopefully us picking something up, but we'll see how it goes and I'm sure we'll catch up. Or maybe we won't. Maybe you'll be in the Premiership this next year, or maybe we'll be relegated, or maybe we will catch up. Who knows?
Well, hopefully we're in the Premier League next year and you guys stay up.
Well, fingers crossed. That'll be a decent situation. I'll take that.
Absolutely. Best for both of us.
So hopefully next time we meet, talking about another 3 points, we're talking about positive performance, some good signings, some good young lads, some of the bad eggs, hopefully moving out for good money. And fingers crossed we're in a lot rosier position because one win can change everything. But thanks again as always for joining in. Thanks for listening to me ramble on. Thanks for listening to me chat. And I hope you enjoy your Saturday. And I hope Sky Sports see a good game that goes in our favour. Look after yourself.